everyone. I'm Tara Joseph, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce, and it's my real pleasure today to welcome Dr. David Owens, who is from OTNP Healthcare. Now, you may be asking why the American Chamber, a business chamber, would like to give you a presentation about vaccines and why it's important to get vaccinated. That sounds like a health issue, doesn't it? Well, it is an important health concern, but at the Chamber, we're also really concerned about the impact of vaccines on Hong Kong, on Hong Kong's people, and also on rebooting and resetting the economy to make Hong Kong a competitive place. Now, that takes the work of all of us to beat COVID, which has kept us isolated and insulated for many, many months. Of course, your health is of prime concern. And that's why we really thought it would be important to bring along Dr. David Owens to tell you sort of honestly and openly from a medical opinion what it means to get a vaccine. A lot of concerns out there about the COVID vaccines and whether they're good for you and whether there's something to be nervous about. Thanks very much for being with us. I'm just going to give a brief overview of your qualifications. You qualified in the UK, but you've been practicing in Hong Kong since 1987. You're a founding partner of the OTNP medical practice. You're an honorary clinical assistant professor in family medicine at Hong Kong University and a chief medical officer of the Hong Kong Rugby Unit. You've been speaking quite a bit on COVID and following it, obviously, with great interest and worry since the virus began. So over to you, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to try to give you some help in navigating this difficult problem. When we're dealing with infectious diseases, just to give a little bit of background, we really have two different factors that we have to think about. We have the exposure risk and the host response. This means if we're never exposed to COVID or we're never exposed to chickenpox or measles, we will never get one of those infections. If we are exposed, whether we get the infection or how ill we become depends upon our age, our general physical condition, and specifically whether we have immunity against that condition. So in Hong Kong, we've been focusing very much on the left side of this equation, the exposure risk. Social distancing, masks, border controls, including quarantine, they all reduce the probability that somebody's going to get exposed to an infection. And as you know, we've done very, very well in Hong Kong with very low numbers of infections. But the downside to that is we have very little immunity. And that's the reason that we're now moving towards a vaccination program. What's immunity? Immunity is the ability to resist an infection. And this picture of the virus to the right, the big orange glob is a virus. The little fluffy orange bits on the outside, those are the spike protein. And those proteins are important. They sort of screw into the receptor, the ACE receptor, which is found in our nose and our airways, and that helps the virus to infect the cells. On the outside, the white bits that you see, these are antibodies. These are like nature's soldiers. They recognize the spike protein and they produce antibodies and they attack and they destroy the virus before it can do us any harm. So it's a sort of balance between our natural defensive mechanisms and the ability of the virus to overcome those mechanisms. Now, there's really only two ways in which we can develop immunity. We can get immunity naturally if we get the illness or the infection, or we can get the immunity via immunization. And one of the questions I get asked most commonly is, you've been writing a lot about this. You've been telling us that the disease is generally not that severe for young and healthy people. And in Hong Kong, certainly we don't have very much infection. And yet now you're going around telling everybody we need to be vaccinated. Why is that? And the answer is that in Hong Kong, we've had very little infection, but we have no immunity. And this is a map of England, and I apologize to the US Chamber for using a map of England in Hong Kong, but it's a particularly good demonstration, I think, of the reason that we're so cautious in Hong Kong still. This, if you look at the top of this map, it's the 10th of November, 2020. And at that time, the UK were getting thousands of cases. And if this map is yellow, the yellow means that of every case that was occurring on that particular day, 100% were caused by the old-fashioned variants, the old, well-known established disease. And in the bottom right-hand corner of the map of England, you can see the different colors going from orange through to purple and then eventually almost black. And those represented, the black is 100% of the cases were caused by the new variant. Now, I'm going to play this a little video, and I'd like you to watch the change in the map and the change in the dates. And you'll see that over about 6 weeks, this new variant burned through the UK. This is what we're seeing in Europe now. It's what is we're also seeing in the US, where there's the fear of the third wave in the US and in Europe, the fourth wave. If you see the inset at that point, the dark of London, my son is an intensive care doctor in East London. And at that time, the hospitals, it was taking 6 to 8 hours for the ambulances to offload into the hospitals. The hospital system almost broke down. It didn't quite, but it almost broke down. And this is why in Hong Kong, public health doctors are still talking about how important it is that we keep social distancing measures, that we keep controls on the border, because the new variants are about 50% to 100% more infectious than the old variants. And so in one ways, you can look at this to say, Hong Kong is like a large area, a very fine tinder that's just waiting for a match for it to catch fire. And in many ways, epidemics are like fires. When they burn, they can overload the health system. So we have no immunity. We don't have infection, but we don't have immunity, which makes us vulnerable. Now, one way in which we can develop immunity is by immunization. The other way is by having natural infection. And I think you'll see in the United States, for example, now, although there's been a little uptake recently, there are some parts of the United States where antibody levels are suggesting we're getting quite close to herd immunity. And I think certainly in the UK, very close to herd immunity, and probably in Israel, they're at herd immunity. Many parts of the world, we're still off herd immunity. So we're looking for vaccines to help us to get there. This map is to put it in a bit of context. I qualified in 1982, and I saw my first case of HIV at that time. We still don't have a vaccine. I saw my first case of COVID 1 year ago, actually 15 months ago, and we have a number of vaccines, and the World Health Organization has 280 vaccine trials under development. It's an absolutely unbelievable achievement to get vaccinations so quickly. And I think with that comes some very reasonable questions. Have the vaccines been rushed? Well, I don't believe the vaccines have been rushed. I think they've certainly been accelerated. We've been through the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. They've been compressed, and we've released the vaccines quicker under emergency license in the view of the pandemic. That's brought with it, valid questions about safety. I would say that we now have hundreds of millions, it's over 500 million doses of vaccination that have been given, and we have a lot of data on safety, and we have some questions on some specific areas of data safety. I'd be more than happy to address, but I think broadly, when we deal with safety, we have short-term mild safety issues like allergic reactions or fever or pain at the injection site, and we've got a really good handle on those. There are some smaller, much less common conditions, and maybe they're occurring at a slightly higher incidence, and it's going to take a little bit more time before we can be certain about those. In Hong Kong, we have a vaccine agency, and we have expert medical panel who are investigating. In particular, at the moment, we have the packaging issue with BioNTech, and we have the issues with Sinovac and maybe some thrombosis. I must say, I do think that they're going to show to be safe, and I expect them, the BioNTech vaccine, to be back very, very quickly. Very brief summary of how vaccines work. We have different platforms that we can build vaccines on. It's like having a sort of different base, and we can use different factories to build the vaccines. If I could think about these in three, the bottom two, the middle two, and the top two. And the bottom two is where we use the whole virus. On the right, it's a live, attenuated vaccine. We don't have those for COVID. An example of that would be measles vaccine. It's live and we inject the whole virus, but it's been modified so it doesn't cause disease in humans. On the other side, we have the inactivated vaccines. And Sinovac and Sinopharm, the China vaccines, are inactivated. Because they're inactivated, they don't create quite so good an immune response. And so we have to use another chemical, which is called an adjuvant, and that boosts the immune response. And so they're a sort of old-fashioned, tried and tested way of building vaccines. In the middle, we have on the left, the RNA vaccines. So this would be like Pfizer and Moderna, and there are others under development. And these really are the new super duper, potentially, I think the RNA vaccines could be the single greatest move forward in my whole career. They really are potentially an extraordinary leap medically. A small area of RNA, messenger RNA, is injected into the body in a fat plasmid. This is taken up into the outside of the cell. It does not go into the nucleus and it does not change the DNA. But the RNA sort of borrows the cell's factories to build spike protein. And the spike protein recognizes this as foreign, and we produce antibodies, or nature's soldiers, which will fight against those spike protein. On the other side, also new, Novavax is an example of a subunit vaccine. If I could hugely oversimplify this, with Novavax, we build in factories lots of spike protein, and we inject that into the body. So in both of these situations, we're using either the body to build or we are injecting spike protein. On the top two, on the left, we have the DNA vaccines. These are under research and development. And on the right, we refer to them as the viral vector vaccines. These are DNA viruses. In the case of AstraZeneca, which is one of the most well-known one, Johnson & Johnson is also a viral vector vaccine. It's a virus that causes a very mild infection in chimpanzees. And we've taken this virus and changed it a little bit to tweak the DNA so that the DNA is carried into the body and it again goes through the process of building spike protein. So 6 platforms that work in a slightly different way. This is a picture of the virus, and the red on the outside is the spike protein. This red, as I mentioned, it sort of screws into the cell and allows the code from inside to get into the cell and replicate and cause infection. And the body is also building soldiers to fight against those and recognize those spike proteins. So it's either a whole virus in the form of the inactivated vaccines, or it's different methods of either introducing or making artificial spike protein is the way that we generate immunity. In Hong Kong, the government took the view, and I think a very reasonable view a few months ago, that they would procure 3 vaccines from 3 different groups. They sort of took one from the bottom, one from the middle, and one from the top. And this sort of made sense because at that time, as the research was ongoing, we weren't completely sure which was going to be the most effective. And so we decided to go with 3 different types of vaccination. I'll come to the specific evidence for vaccines in a moment, but if I could just explain, this is a very simple but really, really important concept. And when we vaccinate, there are two totally different reasons that we vaccinate. We vaccinate for direct immunity and we vaccinate for indirect benefit. And direct, this answers the question, if I'm vaccinated, how less likely am I to become seriously ill or die from this disease? So this is about the benefit to me as an individual. And the great news about this is all of these vaccines are really fantastic on an individual level. They're really, really good as a direct benefit. And I'll give some data and evidence about this in a moment. And the second question, which is fundamentally different, but it's if we can vaccinate a lot of people, can we protect some of the people in our population who have not been vaccinated? Maybe people who can't be vaccinated because at the moment we can't vaccinate children or in pregnancy, or maybe there's some people who have illnesses that preclude them from vaccination. And this is the sort of concept of herd immunity. So we know that if we can get about 2/3, it's likely to be, of people vaccinated, we can protect everybody, because herd immunity is good for everybody. And this is a sort of diagrammatic model of how, if you can imagine the person to the left who maybe walks into a bar or in a gym and in the past would have produced a large cluster, you can see how the green people who are either vaccinated or maybe they've had the infection naturally, they're immune, let's say, they are protecting the people from the outside, even though some of the people from the outside have not been vaccinated. So this is the concept of herd immunity. So sort of two reasons to get vaccinated: to protect yourself and to protect the population. And another thing which is we need to understand when we're dealing with vaccines is all of these vaccines sort of work in slightly different ways, and they work to different degrees. And if you think from the left, a perfect vaccine would actually stop any form of infection. It would stop transmission. But it may be that people get infected, but they're very, very mild infection or no illness, let's say. Or maybe they're so ill, but they go to hospital, but they don't go to intensive care, or they don't die. And so when we're studying vaccines, we really only study how, we call it the efficacy. This is the term that we give for effectiveness, but that effectiveness is under very specific circumstances in a very much in a controlled trial. So for instance, I think almost everybody knows that the Pfizer vaccine in the studies in the US was 95% efficacious, but that was at preventing symptomatic disease in a specific population in the US in last summer when it was done. So that's what we knew about that. It was very good in a trial. And we can't really compare that study with another study that says 76% or another study that says 59%, unless we know exactly what was done, what was measured, what were the terms, who were the people, what was going on in the community at that time. So you can't really compare studies so easily. But it's very important to understand that to different degrees, all of these vaccines seem to push down this pyramid, so to speak. So they all seem good enough at stopping severe disease and death. And we are now increasingly seeing that some of them at least are producing really right the way down to asymptomatic infections, or maybe even no infections at all. And this is where we move into, it's a simple idea, but it's really important. Efficacy is the name that we give in a study situation, but effectiveness is the name that we give when we do a study of lots and lots of people in a real life situation. So what we've now done is we've given hundreds of millions of doses of vaccination, and as a result, we've been able to measure what happens in large populations when we give these vaccines. And these are some studies that have been shown to be incredibly effective. In healthcare workers, the Siren study was in the UK, and on Israeli healthcare workers, both of these studies showed effectiveness of 90%-ish after 2 doses. And very importantly, they also showed, in the case of the UK study, a 50% reduction in the family members of healthcare workers. Healthcare workers have more infections than the average. And in this population group, they looked at the family members when healthcare workers had been vaccinated, but the family members had not been vaccinated. And in the UK, it's about a 50%, and in Israel, it was about 90%. And I apologize again to the, being with the American Chamber, there was actually a great study came out of the CDC. It was published yesterday, and I'd already sent this across. So that also showed 80% effectiveness in US healthcare workers after a single dose of BioNTech or Moderna, the CDC data was, and 90% after 2 doses, and also showed reduction in transmission. This is one of the biggest studies that's been done so far in Scotland, where in the UK took the view of vaccinating a large percentage, that almost at 50% of the population now have been vaccinated with 2 vaccines, AstraZeneca and the Pfizer or BioNTech vaccine. And they've shown in this particular study, elderly, vulnerable individuals, 90% reduction in hospital admissions, and almost 100%, it's actually 99 in both of them, % reduction in mortality. So the effectiveness studies are very, very effective, and they're very big. So, for example, the Pfizer study, where we originally found out that it was 95% effective, was on 40,000 people. This one study in Israel is on 600,000 people. So, and then the CDC was actually, the US healthcare study was a small numbers, but it was a very well conducted and highly valid study. The UK studies were much larger. So the studies of effectiveness are showing really consistently, internationally, after millions of doses, the vaccines are really, really effective in population terms. We know that the vaccines are safe, at least in comparison to other vaccines that we give, and at least in the short term. There are some questions at the moment about AstraZeneca, for example. There are some questions about thrombosis, and maybe just to use that as an example, not maybe to focus too much on that, but the UK has taken the view that the risks are very, very small. The original question, the incidence of the condition is about 1 in a million, and there was a suggestion it might be 4 in a million. In Canada, there was a question that it might be 10 in a million, but we know this is of a particular type of thrombosis. We know that COVID itself has a risk of thrombosis of about 1,000 in a million. And as an example, we know that the contraceptive pill has a risk of about 400 in a million. So these are sort of, I'm just using these as examples. They're very, very small risks, but important risks. And different countries have made slightly different decisions. The UK has made the decision, we're going to keep going with that vaccine because we know on balance it's saving lives because it's reducing the mortality in the population at the moment. Canada has taken the view, well, hang on a minute, we've got other choices of vaccines that maybe don't have that risk. We're going to wait until we've got more information. And I'm using this as an example of how public health decisions are being made in a rapidly changing environment. And even given the same data, different jurisdictions might make a different decision. And I think it would be safe to say, if I was, we're talking from a Hong Kong perspective, so we have very low risk of disease in our community at the moment. So we all know living here, the risks of COVID are very small. We're all keen to get the public health restrictions lifted so we can open the borders and business and life can get back to normal. But we want to do that in a way that's as safe as possible. And so I think it's prudent that the health sort of experts analyze all the potential issues with any of the vaccinations. and that's happening with the questions around Sinovac and the packaging around BioNTech, and that sort of precise example and specific example I gave of AstraZeneca. We've got quite a good handle on the general safety data, and with those, with the exception that we really need to look carefully as we roll out. We've given hundreds of millions of doses, and we've got good evidence of safety, at least for some of the vaccines, and we've got excellent evidence of effectiveness. COVID is a severe disease as we get older, and so of course there's an argument to say, let's just vaccinate the vulnerable, and we'll wait and we'll get more data for younger populations. But of course, we do need herd immunity if we're going to get our population back to normal. And so this is the balance that we're currently undertaking in our population. So in terms of the challenges going forwards, one of the challenges is vaccine hesitancy. In Hong Kong, we're seeing a surprisingly low uptake in comparison to many parts of the world. In the US, for example, I know that it certainly until recently, it's been a chase to get hold of vaccination, whereas in Hong Kong, you can book an appointment. Until recently, you could book an appointment, and there were plenty of slots available every day. We don't know how easy it's going to be to get a herd immunity here, because that's going to depend on how much vaccinations we can do. There's issues around variants. At the moment, the vaccines are effective in dealing with the variants, at the very least in terms of pushing us down that pyramid to stop death and severe disease. But there is a chance that the variants will change and will make infections which are sort of resistant to some of the vaccines. And the good news about the RNA vaccines is we can then retweak the code and we can rebuild a vaccine, and we can probably do that quite quickly, as in within months. We're probably going to need booster doses. I anticipate that at least over the next few years, we'll probably have some boosters once a year, and maybe with slightly different vaccines to cover any changes in the infections. We're going to find more. We just started doing research in children, and we're going to find more about pregnancy and other specific vulnerable populations. So at the moment, we're just giving it in those that we have adequate data on. And we probably will be able to mix the vaccines, but again, we don't completely have evidence on that. These studies are all ongoing. So this is a rapidly evolving, extraordinary pace of change and research. Hundreds of millions, over 500 million doses, and very, very good evidence of effectiveness, and increasing evidence of safety, and that is a quick whiz through vaccines